Hi everyone, today I thought I would talk a little bit about my own personal journey with IBD, Inflammatory Bowel Disease, and hopefully this will come in handy for understanding some of the early symptoms and experiences that you or people you know might have. So my story begins in around 2013. I was working quite hard as a teacher. Around that time, towards the summer, as the pressure of tests and things began to mount up at my school, I began to notice my body behaving a little bit differently. Part of this was self-inflicted. I was sleeping less and eating less. I was occasionally skipping meals in order to save time. And also, ironically at the time, I was a bit overweight, so I was trying to cut down on that. And so everything kind of made sense for me. It didn't matter that I was working hard. To me, it felt good that I was burning the energy off. We went from that to eventually, when I did sit down to eat meals, I began to notice that I was feeling full very, very quickly. So my appetite was beginning to go on the slide. I just generally felt exhausted when I ate, even socially, and that was not what I had in mind when I started cutting down. I also just began to notice an increased amount of pain and discomfort, particularly coming from the abdomen, but I just generally began to feel rather unwell. Partly because it was hot as well. I was beginning to experience night sweats, and around the same time I probably had some kind of infection because my lymph nodes were up as well. So as I later discovered, these were all kind of red flag symptoms, both for IBD but also for cancer, so that became a bit of a scare when I went to the GP for that. Other symptoms I had around this time that again built up over the space of 2 to 3 months were, of course, the famous change in bowel habit. So I began to find myself going to the bathroom more often. I was getting the runs considerably, so loose stools and diarrhea were becoming kind of a constant problem. Along with all of that, much more gradually to the point where I didn't really notice it, was weight loss. So I began to lose a lot of weight. I lost nearly a third of my body weight actually over the space of about 6 months. But because it was very gradual for me, I didn't really notice that at first, and it was only really when it was pointed out to me a few months later that I thought, yes, actually, I weighed myself and I realised what a massive difference it was. So those were the main symptoms, and of course, along with all of that, an increased feeling of weakness. I just felt very frail, which I shouldn't do in my late 20s. So these were kind of the initial symptoms that started everything off. So after seeing the concern on the faces of my friends and family, I decided to make an appointment to see the GP in the autumn of 2013. I did this, and there was a bit of confusion on the GP's face. He didn't quite want to commit himself to saying what he thought it might be or might not be. So he ordered some tests, blood tests of course. They came back and showed that I was quite anemic, which was a surprise to me. This was all new to me. I've been in pretty good health up until this point, so even anemia, I knew that it was low iron, but I didn't really understand what that meant or why that would have been a factor.
What do you mean?
We also had the stool test, which was the first time I'd ever done one of those, and was mortifying.
No, I don't want to do that.
But on the subject of being mortified, there was much more to come. So I had that, and that showed high signs of infection, and I was also diagnosed with vitamin D deficiency. That came through in the blood test results as well, so I had a lot of vitamin D to top up on, to the point where the pharmacist, when he put the prescription through, thought there may have been a mistake. And then in the summer, in the new year, I had the wonderful experience of going to have an exam. Let's say it was supposed to be a consultation. It said consultation on the paper, but in fact, within 1 minute of my getting into the room, a nurse had asked me to undo my trousers.
All I'm saying is drop trow and show us a little of the old.
So it was pretty obvious he was going to get physical. So that was just what they call a digital rectal exam. So that was just him making sure that there was nothing. I don't even know actually, and that's going to be a theme of all of this. I don't quite know what exactly the purpose of that was, other than I assume it's kind of obvious that if someone has problems to do with their bum, you would look at it. But he ordered a flexible sigmoidoscopy, which I then had a few months later. They found colitis during that. And so that was the first time the word colitis was actually written down on a piece of paper. At that stage, I was supposed to start attending an IBD clinic and to go on to the Inflammatory Bowel Disease / Crohn's and Colitis gastroenterology department. at that particular hospital, but they lost my details and I moved house to a different area at the same time. Sort of semi-miraculously, as it felt at the time, my symptoms improved, and so I didn't follow it up. I don't know whether that was a mistake or not, given that my story obviously resumes a little bit later, but that was where we left the initial phase of proceedings. So it was a Flexi-sig that found some colitis in just one part of the lower bowel. So that was where things stood at that stage. Fast forward to 2020, the year where everything kind of seemed to go wrong for a lot of people. Perhaps that was a trigger for what happened next, I don't know, but all I know is that in about June 2020, while I was teaching from home in the middle of lockdown learning, my symptoms came back with a vengeance. But there was a lot going on at the time which put me off going to the hospital. I suspected that it was a relapse of IBD, didn't have any other symptoms, and so I thought I would wait at least 24 hours to see how things panned out. And the bleeding stopped and actually has not so far returned. And I thought that was more or less a one-off thing. But then the weight loss started again over the next few weeks. Appetite remained okay, actually, but I was going to the loo loads of times during the day, and the weight was just falling off again. So I've got a picture somewhere of what I looked like on the first day of lockdown learning in sort of February, March time, and then what I looked like in July when we finished. It was quite shocking. Again, I had not noticed fully the difference. One thing that's worth pointing out here is that it's good if you've got people around you, if you've got a condition like this, for them to be aware of what the symptoms can be, because sometimes it's them that alert you to a problem that you think that you're kind of pushing to one side or that you're not aware of. That restarted the whole process all over again in terms of going to the GP and getting tested and moving forward from there. So around this time, a whole bunch of trigger foods had to be kicked out of my diet. So coffee, I was relying on that to keep going through lockdown learning, because that was exhausting in a whole different way.
If I'm not mistaken, that's your third cup this morning.
Fourth.
So I've reduced that as much as I could. Things like dairy, if ordinary milk went anywhere near a drink that I was consuming or a cereal that I was eating, total disaster. So that had to go out pretty much completely. Just wanted to sleep the entire day. So then we get to the autumn of 2021, go back to the GP, explain the history, and again, because some of the symptoms are parallel to colon cancer, which is why it should be taken seriously, urgent referral, did all the same tests all over again.
Everything resets itself and starts all over.
Got a new scope in January that year, and this time it was a colonoscopy. It was not a Flexi-sig. They wanted to go all the way around. It was not completely successful. The bowel prep they gave me for that didn't do a great job. That was Movi prep, and so they didn't get all the way around. They confirmed that there had been previous inflammation though, and so we again seemed to be heading towards a diagnosis, which eventually, after another 4 or 5 months of waiting for the consultation, came through as IBD-U, so IBD unclassified or unspecified. So kind of good to get a diagnosis from an actual consultant post scope, but lots of unanswered questions about the unspecified part of things.
What do you mean?
The consultant then puts me on what turns out to be a very low dose, in fact lower than the maintenance dose, as it turns out, of mesalazine octasa, and I kind of trundle along with that, not doing a particularly effective job of helping anything until I have a massive flare-up in around November, and I call the IBD helpline, the one attached to my hospital, and the guy there basically says, your dose is completely insufficient anyway, so we're going to up that. I went on to some steroids for a while, had another scope in colonoscopy in the spring this year, and this time they did get pretty much all the way around, and they found a whole bunch of scarring and inflammation right at the edge of the small bowel, which definitely points towards Crohn's this time rather than ulcerative colitis. but we still don't know. I still don't know. My next consultation is in another couple of months. And that is one of the frustrating things about this whole experience, has been these long waits between a test being done and a consultation happening, and then any kind of feedback or update on the effectiveness of those medications. So what are my overall impressions of how things have gone with me and my story with IBD so far? Well, firstly, the slow nature of things in terms of the NHS. Once you can get a GP appointment, which is at the moment, for me anyway, harder than ever in our area post-COVID. It takes a long time to get an appointment, can still take a long time even for an urgent referral to result in scopes being scheduled. And the last one I had was just, you know, the guy was clearly behind and was just trying to get through it as quickly as possible. He hadn't read the file fully, and the requirement to repeat myself over and over and over again.
You mean we could have come into this room, sat at this table, and had this conversation a dozen times already?
You know, and when you're being rushed on the phone, the odds of you missing something out by mistake when you're trying to answer those questions is quite high. What else? Focus on specific symptoms is a big thing in these consultations. They only really want to know how many bowel movements I've had a day. There's no discussion of fatigue, secondary symptoms, things like mouth ulcers. It's, you know, you can have a really good week where it's perfectly normal, and then you can have a week where you're going 10 times a day, 20 times a day. Do you take an average of the previous 2 weeks, the previous month, the time since the last consultation? And I don't think that a snapshot is helpful for what is a chronic condition that can have lots and lots of ups and downs. And again, the records just not being joined up. So I've got a whole bunch of information from my IBD team. My GP has none of that. And when I get my prescriptions, it just says on the label, as directed by specialists. They don't even know the dosage. Aside from the medical point of view of things, the employment side, there comes a point where this is going to impact your work. And for me, fatigue and teaching don't go very well together. So you're relying on your employers having enough combination of trust and perhaps knowledge of the condition to understand what difficulties you're presenting to them and what solutions are going to work best. Now, let's talk a little bit about the positives of this experience so far. So firstly, hugely reassuring to see how many websites there are that deal with IBD, Crohn's, colitis, and the different types. The one that's helped me the most is Crohn's and Colitis UK, because they seem to be the biggest one in the UK. They're the ones who I joined up to quite soon after I got my first colitis diagnosis. But there are loads of websites and organisations from all sorts of places in the world that are really helpful. So they're not difficult to find. You just Google them up and you'll find a whole load of good advice there, and really reassuring that you're not alone in the process. Social media is active as well. See how many people are brave enough to talk about what in a lot of ways could feel like a taboo subject, because if I hadn't had that in the earlier stages when I was researching this, it would have been very detrimental mentally. And there's a lot of good research being done for drugs and treatments and just general research all across the field. So lots and lots of positive stuff happening. So hopefully that's been useful. What I would say is if you have any of the symptoms that I mentioned earlier on, which I'll put up again in a second, get them checked out, because you are at an elevated risk of colon cancer if you have inflammatory bowel disease, but also a lot of the early symptoms overlap, and you don't want to be taking that kind of a chance. Colon cancer is not to be brushed aside, brushed under the carpet, or had taken chances with. Definitely at least get yourself checked out. Those basic tests, blood tests, stool tests, the fecal calprotectin, those are usually done pretty quickly, and they are very, very helpful in distinguishing between the likelihood of something very, very serious to the point of it being life-threatening or something else. So it's really important that you get those diagnostic tests done as quickly as possible if you have any of these symptoms, whether or not they are new for you. Visit the NHS site, visit the Crohn's and Colitis UK site, and good luck if that's the position you're in. So there it is. I hope you found that helpful, and if you did, please hit like and also subscribe if you'd like to get further updates on videos. See you next time.